I spent 45 years married to someone I was never supposed to be with. And the worst part is not that I didn't know. The worst part is that I did know. Somewhere underneath all the years and all the routine and all the reasons I gave myself to stay, I knew. I knew before the wedding. I knew during the vows. I knew on the drive home from the honeymoon when the silence in the car didn't feel peaceful. It felt like a preview. And you probably believe the same thing I did, that the silence was just something to work through, that love was supposed to be effort, that if you kept showing up, kept pushing, kept being the kind of person who doesn't quit, eventually the thing you were forcing would start to feel natural. It never did. I'll get to the moment that finally broke the whole thing open. I was 71 years old, sitting across from my wife at our kitchen table, and something so small happened that it should have meant nothing, but it undid 45 years in about 10 seconds. I'll tell you what it was, but you need to understand what I believed first, because what I believed is probably what you believe right now, and that's the part that scares me. My name is Harold. I'm 74 years old, and I wasted 45 years of my life being loyal to something that was never right. Not because my wife was a bad person. She wasn't. Margaret was kind and responsible, and she kept a beautiful home, and she showed up to every single event and function and obligation that a wife was supposed to show up to. She wasn't the problem. The marriage wasn't the problem. I was the problem. Because I was the one who knew it was wrong and decided that knowing didn't matter. Let me take you back to where this started, because it didn't start with some tragedy. It started with an assumption I never thought to question. I grew up in the kind of household where marriage was not a choice. It was a sequence. You go to school, you get a job, you find a woman, you marry her, you have children, you stay. Nobody in my family talked about whether they were happy. What came up was whether you were doing the right thing. And the right thing meant endurance. If your marriage was hard, that meant you were building something. And if you're sitting there thinking that sounds old-fashioned, that your generation sees things more clearly, I need you to pay very close attention to what I'm about to tell you, because the words have changed, the belief hasn't. I met Margaret in 1978 at a church social. She was 25, I was 27. She laughed easily, and she was good with people, and she had the kind of confidence I didn't have. I admired her. I genuinely admired her. And I confused that admiration with something deeper. I thought, here's a woman I respect. That must mean she's the one. Because I didn't know there was supposed to be something else. Nobody told me there was supposed to be a feeling underneath the respect, a fit, a recognition, a sense of being understood without performing. We got married in the spring of 1979, and I remember standing at the altar, looking at her walking toward me, and feeling something I couldn't name at the time. It wasn't joy, it wasn't dread. It was the feeling of watching a door close and telling yourself it was the right door. I told myself that for 45 years. The early years weren't bad. That's what made it so easy to stay. We weren't fighting, we weren't miserable, we were just adjacent. We lived in the same house and raised the same children and sat at the same table every night and had conversations that never once went past the surface. I would talk about work, she would talk about the kids, or what needed fixing around the house. And then we would watch television, and then we would go to bed. And I would lie there and stare at the ceiling and think, this is what it's supposed to be. This is what everyone has. But here's what nobody tells you about settling. It doesn't hurt at first. It just feels like ordinary life. The pain comes so slowly, you don't recognize it as pain. You think it's just how things are. You think the low hum of emptiness in your chest is what adulthood feels like. You accommodate it. You rearrange yourself around it. And one morning you wake up and you're 53 years old and you can't remember the last time you said something that was actually true. I stopped saying what I thought around year 6, not because Margaret was cruel or dismissive, she just didn't hear me. I would try to talk about something I'd been reading or thinking about, and she would nod politely and change the subject back to something practical. After a while, I stopped trying. And the thing about stopping is that you don't notice the day you do it. You just realize years later that you haven't spoken honestly in longer than you can remember. There's a moment I haven't told you about yet, a moment that should have been my exit. But I need you to see what happened before it, because otherwise you won't understand why I didn't leave. Our daughter Claire came home from college in the summer of 2001. She was 20 years old, sharp, observant. She'd been away long enough to see our house with fresh eyes. One evening she was sitting in the kitchen while Margaret and I moved around each other in that careful, practiced way we'd developed over 2 decades. Not touching, not talking, just orbiting. Claire watched us for about 10 minutes. Then she said something I have never been able to forget. "Dad, have you two ever actually liked each other?" 9 words. She said it without malice. She wasn't being cruel. She was genuinely asking, like it was something she'd been wondering about for years and had finally decided to say out loud. I laughed. I said, "Of course, sweetheart, don't be silly." Margaret didn't say anything. She just kept wiping down the counter. And that should have been the moment. That should have been the crack I followed all the way down. A 20-year-old could see in 10 minutes what I had refused to see in 22 years. But I didn't follow it. I sealed it over. I told myself Claire was young, that she didn't understand how real marriages work, that what she was seeing wasn't emptiness, it was maturity, stability, the quiet dignity of 2 people who had made a commitment and kept it. That's the lie, that right there, that quiet dignity. I carried that phrase in my chest like a medal. I used it every time the truth tried to surface. Every time I felt the wrongness of it, I told myself I was being honorable, patient, strong. But that wasn't the moment that finally broke me. That came later. One night I came close to saying something. It was 2009, maybe 2010. The kids were grown and gone. Margaret was in the living room reading a magazine. I was standing in the doorway of our bedroom with my car keys in my hand. I don't know where I thought I was going. I hadn't planned anything. But I stood there for a long time, holding those keys, feeling the weight of them, and I almost said it. I almost said, "I don't think I was ever supposed to be here." I put the keys on the dresser. I went to bed. 1 year of silence became 5. 5 became 15. 15 became a life. I stopped reading the books I loved. I stopped calling the friends who knew me before the marriage. I stopped going for drives by myself because Margaret would ask where I'd been, and I didn't want to explain that I just needed to be alone. I stopped mentioning the trip to Portugal I'd always wanted to take. I stopped writing in the notebook I used to keep in my nightstand. I stopped so many things that by the time I was 65, I couldn't have told you what I actually wanted. Not because I'd forgotten, because I had trained myself to stop wanting. And that was not love. That was disappearance. The moment that broke everything open was not dramatic. There was no argument, no betrayal. No one slammed a door or raised their voice. It was a Tuesday in October 2022. I was 71. Margaret and I were eating dinner at the kitchen table. She was telling me about a woman from her book club whose husband had just retired and was driving her crazy being home all day. Margaret was laughing about it, a genuine, full laugh, and I sat there across from her, watching her face, listening to her voice, and I realized something so simple and so enormous that I had to put my fork down. I had never once made her laugh like that, not once in 43 years. She laughed like that with her friends. She laughed like that on the phone with her sister. She laughed like that talking about a stranger's husband, but not with me. And not because I wasn't funny or wasn't trying, because we were not the right people for each other. We never had been. And that laugh, that easy, unguarded, real laugh, was the sound of what she was like when she wasn't with me. I sat there for the rest of the meal without speaking. Afterward, I washed the dishes. I dried every single one by hand. I put them all away. Then I went and sat in my car in the garage for 40 minutes with the engine off. I didn't cry. I just sat there with the overhead light on and my hands on the steering wheel, and I let myself know what I had always known. That was 18 months ago. We're separated now, not divorced. Margaret doesn't fully understand why, and I don't fully know how to explain it to her in a way that doesn't sound like blame. Because it isn't blame. It isn't her fault. It was never her fault. It was mine. My fault for believing that the right thing and the true thing were the same thing. They're not. Sometimes the right thing, the thing everyone applauds you for, the thing that looks like integrity from the outside, is the thing that slowly kills the person you were supposed to become. Now I eat breakfast alone in a small apartment with a window that faces east. The sun comes in around 7. I make eggs and I sit there and I eat them slowly, and nobody needs me to perform, and the silence in this apartment is not the same silence I lived in for 45 years. This silence has me in it. And I want to say something to you now because I think you need to hear it. How long have you been calling it commitment when it's really just fear? When was the last time you told the person you're with what you actually feel? Not what would keep the peace, not what would make the evening easier, but what is actually true. How many things have you stopped doing? How many parts of yourself have you folded up and put in a drawer because they didn't fit inside the life you agreed to? I'm not guessing. I know. Because I told myself the exact same thing for 45 years. I told myself it was patience. I told myself it was maturity. I told myself that the people who leave are weak and the people who stay are strong. But staying in the wrong place is not strength. It is the slowest way to lose yourself. And by the time you realize what you've lost, you are 71 years old, sitting in a garage in the dark, wondering where your life went. If it requires you to become someone you don't recognize, it is not love. It doesn't matter how long you've been there. It doesn't matter what you promised. If you have to disappear to stay, then staying is not the honorable thing. It is the destructive thing. And it is being done to both of you, not just to you. I know that sounds obvious. I know it sounds like something you'd find on a greeting card, but I promise you, it is different when you are standing on the other side of 45 years and you cannot get a single one of them back. I think about Claire's question sometimes. Have you two ever actually liked each other? I think about what would have happened if I had told the truth that night instead of laughing it off. I think about the keys on the dresser, the notebook in the nightstand, the trip to Portugal I never took. I don't think about them with bitterness. I think about them the way you look at a house you used to live in that someone else has remodeled. You recognize the structure, but you don't live there anymore, and you can't go back in. I'm 74 now. I eat eggs by a window. The sun comes in. The apartment is quiet, and the quiet is mine. That's not a happy ending. I want to be clear about that. There is no version of this where 45 years just becomes a lesson and everything feels okay. It doesn't feel okay. It feels like the truth, and the truth is heavier than the lie ever was. I just got tired of carrying the wrong one. If any of this sounds familiar, if something in your chest tightened while I was talking, sit with that for a minute before you scroll past. And if there's someone in your life who's been calling endurance love the way I did, maybe send this to them, not as advice, just as one man's account of what it cost.